My fingers trembled as I applied lipstick for the third time, the coral shade my daughter insisted would bring out my eyes. At 66, I hadn't been on a date in 12 years, not since Harold passed. The mirror reflected a woman I barely recognized, silver hair styled in soft waves instead of my usual bun, a navy dress that actually showed my figure, and eyes that held equal parts terror and anticipation. "You're being ridiculous, Margaret," I whispered to my reflection, but my voice cracked on the words. The bathroom felt too small, too warm, like it was closing in on me. I gripped the marble countertop, feeling the cool stone ground me as my heart hammered against my ribs. The restaurant Helen had chosen was one of those trendy places downtown where young professionals gathered after work, all exposed brick and Edison bulbs. I'd driven past it countless times on my way to the grocery store, never imagining I'd actually eat there, much less meet a stranger there who might become, what? A companion? A boyfriend? The word felt foreign in my mouth, like speaking a language I'd forgotten. I arrived 15 minutes early because punctuality had been drilled into me since childhood, and because I needed time to steady my nerves. The hostess, a girl young enough to be my granddaughter, smiled politely as she led me to a table for two near the window. I smoothed my dress and tried to look like I belonged among the scattered couples and business dinners surrounding me. "Can I start you with something to drink while you wait?" she asked, and I ordered a glass of Chardonnay because my hands needed something to hold and my courage needed fortification. The wine arrived just as I spotted him walking through the door. Helen had shown me his photo from the dating website, but seeing Robert in person was different. He was taller than I'd expected, with broad shoulders that spoke of a lifetime of physical work, and silver hair that caught the restaurant's warm lighting. He wore a navy blazer over khakis, and when he smiled at the hostess, I caught a glimpse of laugh lines that made my stomach flutter in a way I'd forgotten was possible. He spotted me immediately, probably because I was the only woman over 40 dining alone, and his face lit up with genuine warmth. As he approached, I noticed the slight limp in his left leg that he'd mentioned in our phone conversation, a souvenir from his construction days. Something about that vulnerability made me feel less exposed, less alone in my nervousness. "Margaret?" His voice was deeper than it had sounded over the phone, with a slight rasp that suggested years of cigarettes finally given up. "You look lovely." I felt heat rise in my cheeks like a teenager. "Thank you. Please, sit down." I gestured to the chair across from me, hoping he couldn't see how my hand shook slightly. He settled into his seat with a small grunt of effort that he tried to disguise, and I pretended not to notice. We were both playing this game of casual competence, as if meeting strangers for romantic dinners was something we did regularly instead of something that terrified us both. "This place is fancier than I expected," he said, glancing around at the industrial chic decor. "I usually stick to diners and pizza joints." "My daughter chose it," I admitted. "She said it would be age-appropriate, sophisticated, whatever that means." I rolled my eyes, and he laughed, a rich, genuine sound that eased something tight in my chest. "Ah, the kids are managing our love lives now, are they?" He signaled the waitress. "My son practically filled out my dating profile for me. Said my original version made me sound like I was applying for a job at a funeral home." The image struck me as so absurd that I laughed despite my nerves. "What did you originally write?" "Something about being punctual, financially stable, and recently widowed," he said with a sheepish grin. "Apparently that's not romantic." "Well, punctual and financially stable sound pretty good to me," I said, surprised by my own boldness. The wine was helping, or maybe it was just the relief of discovering that Robert seemed as uncertain about this whole process as I was. He ordered a beer, and we spent several minutes studying our menus in the kind of silence that could either be comfortable or excruciating, depending on your perspective. I found myself watching his hands as he turned the pages, large hands with prominent veins and a thin gold band on his right ring finger. A widower's wedding ring, moved but not removed. I understood that completely. "How long has it been?" I asked quietly, nodding toward his hand. He glanced down as if surprised to find the ring there. 3 years. Cancer. It was quick at the end. His voice carried the weight of someone who'd told this story before but never got used to telling it. You. 12 years. Heart attack. The words came easier now than they had in the beginning, but they still felt like admitting to a failure somehow, as if I should have been able to prevent it, should have seen it coming. That's a long time to be alone, he said gently, and there was no judgment in it, just understanding. I wasn't ready before, I said, then realized how that sounded. I mean, I'm not sure I'm ready now, but my daughter says I'm wasting my good years sitting at home with my books and my cat. You have a cat? His eyes lit up. I've got 2. Inherited them from Sarah, my wife. They hate everyone except me, and I'm not entirely sure they like me. Something about the way he said his wife's name, Sarah, with such tenderness even 3 years later, made my chest tighten. Harold had been gone so long that sometimes I had trouble remembering exactly how his voice sounded, but I still said his name the same way, like it was something precious. The waitress appeared to take our order, and I realized I'd been so focused on Robert that I'd barely glanced at the menu. I ordered the first thing my eyes landed on, salmon with risotto, and hoped it wasn't too expensive. Dating etiquette for seniors was a mystery to me. Did we split the check? Did men still pay? Was I supposed to offer? So tell me about these books you read, Robert said once we'd ordered. Helen mentioned you were an English teacher. 43 years, I said with pride. High school mostly, though I taught some middle school early on. I specialized in American literature, but I'll read anything, mysteries, romance, literary fiction, even science fiction if it's well written. Romance novels? He raised an eyebrow with a teasing smile. Should I be worried you have unrealistic expectations for this evening? I felt my face burn. Not those kinds of romance novels, I said quickly, then realized I was being ridiculous. Well, sometimes those too. What's wrong with a little fantasy? He held up his hands in mock surrender. Nothing at all. Sarah used to read them by the stack. Said real life was hard enough without having to read about more problems. Our salads arrived, and I was grateful for the distraction. The conversation was going well, better than I'd dared hope, but I felt like I was constantly on the verge of saying something wrong, something that would reveal how out of practice I was at this whole business of getting to know someone new. What about you? I asked. Helen mentioned construction, but what specifically? Commercial mostly. Office buildings, shopping centers, that sort of thing. I was a foreman for 30 years before my back started complaining. He shifted in his seat, and I caught a glimpse of discomfort crossing his features. Had to retire earlier than I planned, but it worked out. Gave me time to take care of Sarah at the end. There was something in the way he said it, a finality that suggested the topic was closed, and I respected that. We all had parts of our stories that were too tender to share with strangers, even attractive strangers who made us laugh. Do you miss it? The work, I mean. Some days. I miss the guys, the camaraderie. Retirement can be lonely, especially when. He trailed off, but I knew what he meant. Especially when your spouse isn't there to share it with. I know exactly what you mean, I said softly. I thought I'd love having all the time in the world to read, to travel, to do whatever I wanted. But it turns out most of the things I wanted to do with Harold. We sat quietly for a moment, both lost in our respective grief. It wasn't uncomfortable, this shared understanding of loss. If anything, it felt like a relief to be with someone who didn't need me to explain or justify or pretend to be over something that you never really get over. But here we are, Robert said, raising his beer glass in a small toast. Trying something new. Here we are, I agreed, clinking my wine glass against his beer. The sound was crisp and clear in the restaurant's ambient noise, like a small celebration. Our main courses arrived as the restaurant began to fill with the evening crowd. I watched Robert cut his steak with the methodical precision of a man who'd learned to appreciate good food later in life, and found myself relaxing in a way I hadn't expected. There was something comfortable about sharing a meal with someone who understood that dinner was meant to be savored, not rushed. "Tell me about your children," he said between bites. "Helen mentioned you have more than one." "3. Helen's the youngest, and she's taken it upon herself to manage my social life." I smiled despite the mild exasperation in my voice. "She's a nurse practitioner, very practical, very organized. She thinks my hermit tendencies are unhealthy." "And the others?" "My son David lives in Portland with his family. He's a software engineer, married to a lovely woman named Jennifer. They have twin boys who are 13 and absolutely exhausting." I felt the familiar warm glow that came with talking about my grandchildren. "My oldest, Patricia, is in Chicago. She's divorced, works in marketing, has a teenage daughter who thinks her grandmother is hopelessly old-fashioned." "Are you?" Robert asked with a grin. "Hopelessly old-fashioned?" I considered this seriously. "In some ways, yes. I still write thank you notes by hand. I think people should dress up for airplane travel. I believe in using proper grammar even in text messages." I paused, thinking about the dating website Helen had convinced me to join, the awkward profile photos, the strange ritual of messaging with strangers. "But I'm here, aren't I? Having dinner with a man I met on the internet." "That's very modern of you," he said, and there was something in his tone, gentle teasing mixed with admiration, that made me feel younger than I had in years. "What about your family?" I asked. Helen mentioned a son. "Just Michael. He's 38, lives about an hour north of here with his wife and 2 kids. He's a good boy, man, I should say. Still hard to think of him as grown up." Robert's expression softened. "He's been after me to date for 2 years now. Says Sarah would have wanted me to be happy." "Did she?" "Say that, I mean." Robert was quiet for a long moment, and I worried I'd overstepped. These conversations about our late spouses felt like walking through a minefield, one wrong step and you could trigger something painful. "She did," he said finally. "Near the end, when she knew, she made me promise I wouldn't become one of those widowers who just fades away. Said she didn't want to be responsible for me dying of loneliness." He managed a small smile. "She was always practical like that." "Harold never said anything like that," I admitted. "His heart attack was so sudden, there wasn't time for deathbed conversations. Sometimes I wonder what he would have wanted for me." "What do you think he would have wanted?" I considered this, twirling my fork in the risotto. "Harold was protective. Possessive, maybe, though not in a bad way. He liked taking care of me, making decisions for both of us. I think part of him would hate the idea of another man in my life, but the bigger part would hate the idea of me being lonely." "And are you?" "Lonely?" The question hung between us, direct and unavoidable. I could have deflected, made a joke, changed the subject. But there was something about Robert's steady gaze that invited honesty. "Yes," I said simply. "Not all the time, but yes. I have my routines, my books, my volunteer work at the library. But sometimes I'll see something funny on television and turn to share it with someone who isn't there. Or I'll wake up from a dream where Harold and I are young again, and the silence in the house is so complete it feels like drowning." Robert nodded slowly. "I know that silence. It's different from regular quiet, isn't it? It has weight." "Exactly." I felt a rush of gratitude that he understood. Most people, even well-meaning people like Helen, couldn't grasp the particular quality of widowed loneliness. "How do you manage it?" Badly, most days, he said with a rueful laugh. I talk to my cats more than is probably healthy. I've become one of those old men who strikes up conversations with checkout clerks at the grocery store. I joined a woodworking club that meets twice a week, mostly for the company. What do you make? In woodworking? Nothing very impressive. Birdhouses, mostly. Simple boxes with roofs. But there's something satisfying about working with your hands, creating something useful. He paused, looking slightly embarrassed. I made a jewelry box for Sarah a few months before she died. She never got to use it, but I couldn't bring myself to throw it away or give it away. I reached across the table and touched his hand briefly. That's not silly. I still have Harold's coffee mug sitting next to mine in the cabinet. I wash it every few weeks even though no one's used it in 12 years. His hand turned palm up under mine, and for just a moment we were connected by more than conversation. His skin was warm and slightly rough, and I felt a little jolt of something I'd almost forgotten, the simple pleasure of human contact, of touching and being touched by someone who mattered. I pulled my hand back, suddenly self-conscious, but not before I saw something shift in his expression. Interest, maybe. Or recognition of the same jolt I'd felt. This is strange, isn't it? I said, more to break the tension than anything else. Dating at our age. Everything feels like it should be different, but then you realize some things never change. What do you mean? The nerves, the uncertainty about what to say or do. The wondering if the other person finds you attractive, if you'll see each other again. I gestured between us. I thought all of that would be simpler at 66. More mature somehow. And it's not? God, no. If anything, it's more complicated. We're not just bringing our personalities to the table, we're bringing decades of history, grief, established routines, grown children who have opinions about our choices. I laughed, but it came out a little shaky. When I was 26, the worst thing that could happen on a date was awkward conversation or bad chemistry. Now I'm worried about everything from medication schedules to whether my grown daughter will approve of you. Robert smiled. Would she? Approve of me? The question felt loaded with possibility, as if he was asking about more than Helen's hypothetical opinion. I studied his face, the kind eyes behind wire-rimmed glasses, the silver stubble that suggested he'd shaved carefully for our date, the way he held himself with quiet confidence despite his obvious nervousness. I think so, I said carefully. She'd like that you're straightforward, that you make me laugh. She'd probably quiz you about your financial situation and your health insurance, but that's just Helen being practical. And what would you like her to like about me? The question caught me off guard with its directness. I took a sip of wine, buying time to think, but the answer came more easily than I expected. That you understand about the silence, I said. That you don't try to fix things or rush things or pretend grief is something you get over instead of something you carry. That you're here despite being scared, just like me. Something in his expression softened, and I realized we'd crossed some invisible line from small talk to real conversation, from polite strangers to two people genuinely trying to understand each other. I am scared, he admitted. Terrified, actually. I haven't felt this nervous since I asked Sarah to marry me 42 years ago. What are you scared of? Getting it wrong. Saying something stupid. Being too old, too set in my ways, too damaged by loss to be worth your time. He paused, then added more quietly, or finding out that you are worth my time, and then having to figure out what that means. I felt my heart speed up at his honesty. That's exactly what I'm afraid of too. The restaurant had grown busier as the evening progressed, filling with couples and groups that made our corner table feel both more intimate and more exposed. I was hyper-aware of the other diners, wondering if they saw us as a sweet elderly couple or if our nervousness was as obvious as it felt. Can I ask you something that might be too personal? Robert said as we finished our main courses. My stomach clenched slightly. You can ask. I might not answer. Fair enough? He leaned forward slightly, lowering his voice. What made you decide to try this? Dating, I mean. After 12 years, something must have changed. I considered lying, giving him some version of the story that made me sound more confident, more ready. But his honesty deserved mine in return. My doctor, I said, and his eyebrows rose. Not in a medical sense. But I had my annual physical last month, and Dr. Martinez asked about my social connections, my support system. When I listed my children and a few friends from church, he said something about humans being social creatures, about the health benefits of companionship. That's when you decided to date? That's when I realized I was hiding. The words came out more forcefully than I'd intended. I'd been telling myself I was fine, that I was honoring Harold's memory by staying faithful to his ghost. But really, I was just scared. Scared of getting hurt again, scared of having to explain myself to someone new, scared of my body and my life not being what they used to be. Robert nodded slowly. What changed your mind? Helen, partially. She's been pushing me for 2 years, and I finally ran out of excuses. I twisted my napkin in my lap. But mostly, I realized I was wasting something precious. I'm 66, but I'm healthy. I still have energy, curiosity, love to give. Harold wouldn't have wanted me to bury all of that with him. No, Robert said softly. I don't think he would have. We sat quietly for a moment, the weight of that admission settling between us. I felt exposed and relieved at the same time, as if I'd finally said something I'd been carrying around for months. Your turn, I said. What made you finally listen to your son? Robert smiled ruefully. Sarah's birthday. This past March, it would have been her 70th. Michael came over to spend the day with me, and afterward he said something that stuck with me. What did he say? He said I was grieving so hard that I'd forgotten I was still alive. Robert's voice caught slightly. He said Sarah fell in love with a man who was fully engaged with life, who built things and laughed and took chances. He asked if she'd recognized the man I'd become. I felt a pang of recognition. That's hard to hear. It was. But it was also true. He looked directly at me. I realized I'd been using grief as an excuse to stop trying, stop risking, stop hoping for anything beyond just getting through each day. And now I'm sitting across from a beautiful woman in a restaurant I never would have chosen, talking about things I haven't talked about in 3 years, and feeling more awake than I have since Sarah died. He paused. It's terrifying, but it's also alive. The word hung between us, loaded with possibility and hope. I felt something shift in my chest, a loosening of tension I hadn't even realized I'd been carrying. I need to tell you something, I said suddenly, the words tumbling out before I could second-guess them. Something I said earlier wasn't entirely true. Robert's expression grew wary. Okay. When I said I wasn't sure if I was ready for this, for dating, I was lying. I took a deep breath. I know I'm not ready. I don't know the rules anymore, I don't know what I want or what to expect, and I have no idea how to balance honoring Harold's memory with building something new. Margaret. Let me finish. I held up a hand. I'm not ready, but I'm here anyway. Because being ready is a luxury I can't afford anymore. I'm 66 years old, and I've already lost 12 years to grief and fear and the comfortable misery of routine loneliness. Robert was watching me intently, and I couldn't read his expression. I don't know if I can fall in love again, I continued. I don't know if I can share my space or compromise on my routines or navigate the complicated feelings that come with caring about someone new. But I know I want to try. I know I want to find out what's possible. The silence stretched between us, and I began to worry that I'd said too much, revealed too much, scared him off with my intensity. But then Robert smiled, really smiled, with genuine warmth and something that looked like relief. "Thank you," he said simply. "For being honest. For not pretending this is easy or that you have it all figured out. Do you think I'm crazy? For wanting to try something I'm not ready for?" "I think you're brave," he said. "Braver than me. I've been telling myself I need to be ready before I can move forward, but maybe ready is something you become by doing, not something you achieve by waiting." I felt tears prick at my eyes, though I couldn't have said whether they were from relief or fear or something else entirely. This is harder than I thought it would be. The dinner. The honesty. The hope. I dabbed at my eyes with my napkin. It would be easier to go home to my books and my cat and convince myself that this life is enough. "But it's not enough," Robert said gently. "Is it?" "No," I whispered. "It's not enough." We sat looking at each other across the table, two people who had stumbled into something neither of us had expected when we'd nervously gotten dressed for dinner a few hours ago. The conversation had moved far beyond first-date pleasantries into something rawer and more real. "So where does that leave us?" Robert asked. It was a fair question, and I realized I had no idea how to answer it. In my limited dating experience from 40-plus years ago, this would be the moment when someone suggested a second date or exchanged phone numbers or made plans to see each other again. But this felt bigger than that, more consequential. "I don't know," I admitted. "I've never done this before. Not at this age, not with this much history." "Neither have I," he said. "Maybe we can figure it out together?" The suggestion was so simple and yet so loaded with implication that I felt my breath catch. Together? The word suggested partnership, collaboration, mutual discovery. It suggested that this wasn't just about two lonely people filling an evening, but about two people choosing to explore possibility despite fear. "I'd like that," I said, surprised by how steady my voice sounded. "I'd like to figure it out together." Robert's smile was like sunrise after a long night. "Good. That's good." The waitress appeared to clear our plates and offer dessert, but neither of us was interested in prolonging the meal. We were both processing what had just happened between us, the unexpected depth of connection we'd stumbled into. "Coffee?" Robert asked. "Or would you like to take a walk? There's a nice path along the river not far from here." "A walk sounds perfect," I said, though my heart rate picked up at the thought of extending our time together, of moving from the safe confines of the restaurant into something less structured. Robert paid the check despite my protests, and soon we were standing on the sidewalk outside the restaurant. The evening air was crisp but not cold, perfect for walking. He offered me his arm with old-fashioned courtesy, and after a moment's hesitation, I took it. The river path was quieter than I'd expected for a Friday evening, with just a few joggers and dog walkers sharing the paved walkway that curved along the water's edge. Street lamps cast pools of warm light at regular intervals, and the city lights reflected off the dark water in wavering lines of gold and white. "This is lovely," I said, grateful for the excuse to walk slowly. Robert's limp was more pronounced after sitting for 2 hours, and I found myself matching his careful pace without thinking about it. "I come here sometimes when I can't sleep," he said. "There's something about moving water that's calming." "Do you have trouble sleeping?" "Since Sarah died, yes." "You?" "Sometimes. The house feels too quiet at night. I've started falling asleep with the television on, just for the voices." We walked in comfortable silence for a while, and I found myself hyper-aware of the warmth of his arm under my hand, the steady rhythm of our footsteps, the way other couples and individuals moved past us in their own evening routines. I wondered what we looked like to them, a married couple out for an evening stroll, or two people on a first date trying to figure each other out. "Can I ask you about something you said earlier?" Robert said as we paused at a bench overlooking the water. "Of course." you mentioned that some things never change about dating. But what feels different now? Besides the obvious things like having more history. I considered the question as we sat down on the bench. The metal was cold through my dress, and I was glad I'd brought a light jacket. Everything has higher stakes now, I said finally. When I was young, dating was about having fun, figuring out what I wanted, learning about myself through relationships with other people. If something didn't work out, there was always time to try again with someone else. And now? Now it feels like I'm choosing a companion for the rest of my life, however long that might be. There's no time for casual relationships or figuring things out slowly. If I'm going to open my heart to someone, if I'm going to rearrange my carefully constructed life to make room for another person, it has to be worth it. Robert nodded thoughtfully. That's a lot of pressure. It is. And it's not just about us, is it? We both have children who will have opinions, grandchildren who need to be considered. We have established homes, financial situations, health considerations. I laughed, but it sounded a little hollow. Romance is supposed to be about possibility and discovery, but at our age it feels like it's mostly about logistics. Do you really believe that? Robert asked gently. The question made me pause. I don't know. I want to believe that romance can exist at any age, that it's never too late to surprise yourself or be surprised by someone else. But practically speaking... Forget practically speaking for a minute, he said. What do you want? Not what makes sense or what's realistic, but what do you actually want? I stared out at the water, watching the reflected lights dance on the surface. It was such a simple question, but I realized I'd been avoiding thinking about it directly for months. I want to fall in love again, I said quietly. Not the same way I loved Harold, that was young love, built on shared dreams and the assumption that we had forever. I want to fall in love the way you can only love when you understand how precious and fragile it is. That sounds beautiful. It also sounds impossible, I added. How do you fall in love when you're terrified of losing someone again? How do you open yourself up to that kind of vulnerability when you know how much it hurts when it ends? Maybe that's exactly why it's worth doing, Robert said. Because you know how much it hurts when it ends, you also know how much joy you're missing when it's not there. I turned to look at him, struck by the simple wisdom of what he'd said. Is that what you want too? To fall in love again? I want to feel alive again, he said. For the past 3 years, I've been existing, surviving, getting through. But tonight, sitting here with you, I remember what it feels like to be present in my own life. Something in his voice made my chest tighten with emotion. Robert. I know we just met, he said quickly. I know this is probably too much too fast, and I don't want to scare you off. But I need you to know that this evening has been the best few hours I've had since Sarah died. Not because I'm trying to replace her or forget her, but because you've reminded me that I'm still capable of connection, of interest in another person, of hope. I felt tears well up in my eyes again, but this time they didn't feel sad. They felt like release, like recognition, like the natural response to unexpected grace. You haven't scared me off, I said softly. If anything, you've scared me into hope. What does that mean? It means I came here tonight expecting to have a pleasant dinner with a nice man and maybe, if things went well, agree to see him again sometime. I didn't expect to have the kind of conversation that changes how you think about yourself and your life. Robert reached for my hand, and this time I didn't pull away. His fingers were warm and strong, and the simple gesture felt both thrilling and comforting. So what happens now? He asked. I don't know, I said honestly. But I know I want to find out. I want to see you again. I want to have more conversations like this one. I want to discover what's possible between two people who aren't young anymore but aren't done living. Even though it's scary? Especially because it's scary. I squeezed his hand. I've been playing it safe for 12 years, and all it's gotten me is loneliness and the illusion of security. Maybe it's time to try something that scares me. We sat quietly for a moment, holding hands on a bench by the river, two people who had surprised themselves with their own courage and honesty. The night felt full of possibility in a way I'd forgotten was possible. "I should probably get you home," Robert said eventually. "It's getting late, and I don't want your daughter to worry." "Helen's not expecting me back at any particular time," I said. "She told me to stay out as late as I wanted, that she hoped I'd have a good enough time to lose track of time." "And have you?" "Lost track of time." I looked at my watch, surprised to discover it was nearly 10 o'clock. We'd been talking for almost 4 hours. "I suppose I have." "Good," Robert said, standing and offering me his arm again. "Sarah always said the best evenings were the ones where you forgot to watch the clock." As we walked back toward the restaurant where our cars were parked, I found myself thinking about Sarah and Harold, about the strange way our late spouses seemed to hover around the edges of this new connection, not as obstacles but as witnesses, as the people who had taught us how to love in the first place. "Robert," I said as we reached the parking lot. "Yes. Thank you. For being honest, for being patient, for being brave enough to try this too. Thank you for saying yes when Helen suggested we meet. Thank you for being here, for being yourself, for not pretending this is easy." We stood next to my car, neither quite ready to end the evening. The parking lot was well lit but mostly empty, and the air held the promise of changing seasons. "Will you call me?" I asked, then immediately felt foolish for the question. We weren't teenagers. We were adults who could speak directly about what we wanted. "I'd like to see you again," Robert said. "Soon, if you're willing. Maybe something less formal than dinner? A movie, or a museum, or just coffee?" "Coffee sounds perfect," I said. "Tomorrow?" His eyebrows rose. "Tomorrow? That's not too soon?" "I'm 66 years old," I said with a sudden burst of clarity. "I don't have time for games or artificial waiting periods. If I want to see you tomorrow, why shouldn't I?" Robert's smile was brilliant. "Tomorrow it is. There's a little cafe near the bookstore on Main Street. Do you know it? Grind Coffee?" "Yes, I go there sometimes to read." 10 o'clock? Perfect." He walked me to my car and waited while I fumbled with my keys, my hands shaking slightly from nerves or excitement or the evening air. When I'd unlocked the door and turned to say goodbye, he leaned down and kissed my cheek softly. "Good night, Margaret," he said. "Thank you for a wonderful evening." "Good night, Robert." I drove home with the radio off, wanting to preserve the quiet contentment that had settled over me. The familiar streets looked different somehow, as if I were seeing them through new eyes, or as if the evening had shifted something fundamental in how I moved through the world. My house felt different when I walked in, though nothing had changed in the few hours I'd been gone. Princess, my tabby cat, wound around my legs with her usual greeting, but even her familiar purr sounded different, less like the only companionship I had, and more like one note in a life that might be expanding to include other sources of warmth and connection. I hung up my jacket and caught sight of myself in the hallway mirror. My hair was slightly mussed from the evening breeze, my lipstick long worn off, but there was something in my expression I hadn't seen in years. I looked alive, present, like a woman who had just spent the evening discovering that she was still capable of surprising herself. The phone rang as I was changing into my nightgown, and I knew without looking that it would be Helen. She'd been texting me periodically throughout the evening, subtle check-ins disguised as casual messages, and I'd ignored them all, too caught up in the moment to think about reporting back to my daughter. "Mom." Helen's voice was carefully casual when I answered. "How was dinner?" I settled into my favorite reading chair, Princess immediately jumping into my lap. "It was good. Really good. Just good." I could hear the smile in her voice. You've been gone for almost 5 hours. That seems like more than just good. We talked, I said, realizing how inadequate that sounded. We went for a walk after dinner. He's a good man, Helen. I told you he was. Are you going to see him again? Tomorrow morning? Coffee. The words came out with a certainty that surprised me. 12 hours ago, the thought of committing to a second date would have sent me into a panic of second-guessing and what-ifs. Mom, that's wonderful. Helen's excitement was genuine, but I could hear the underlying note of maternal concern. How are you feeling? Are you okay? It was such a Helen question, practical, caring, focused on my emotional well-being. She'd been taking care of me, in small and large ways, ever since Harold died. Making sure I ate properly, that I stayed connected to friends, that I didn't disappear too completely into my grief and solitude. I'm scared, I said honestly. And excited. And confused. And hopeful. I paused, trying to find words for the tangle of emotions churning in my chest. I'd forgotten what it felt like to look forward to something. Oh, Mom. Helen's voice went soft with understanding. I'm so happy for you. It's just coffee, I said quickly, as if saying it could make it less significant, less loaded with possibility. No, it's not, Helen said gently. It's you choosing to be open to something new. It's you deciding that your story isn't over yet. After we hung up, I sat in my chair for a long time, princess purring in my lap, thinking about what Helen had said. My story isn't over yet. For so many years, I'd felt like my real life had ended with Harold, that everything since then was just epilogue, just waiting. But tonight had felt like a beginning, not a continuation of an ending. It had felt like the first page of something new, something I couldn't yet name or predict. I tried to read before bed, but the words wouldn't stick. My mind kept drifting back to moments from the evening, the way Robert's eyes crinkled when he laughed, the steadiness of his voice when he talked about Sarah, the warmth of his hand in mine as we sat by the river. When I finally turned off the light, I lay awake staring at the ceiling, my body humming with an energy I'd almost forgotten existed. It wasn't sexual attraction, exactly, though there had been flickers of that too, surprising and welcome after so many years of feeling disconnected from my physical self. It was something broader and deeper, the recognition that I was still capable of genuine interest in another person, still able to be moved and surprised and delighted by human connection. I thought about what I'd told Robert about wanting to fall in love again, about the different quality that love might have at this stage of life. Young love was about building something together from nothing, about shared dreams and the luxury of time. But love at 66 would have to be something else, more intentional, more precious, built on the knowledge of what it meant to lose someone you couldn't imagine living without. The thought should have been terrifying, but lying there in the dark, it felt more like a promise than a threat. Saturday morning arrived crisp and bright, with the kind of autumn sunshine that made everything look freshly minted. I woke before my alarm, unusual for someone who had cultivated the luxury of sleeping in during retirement, and found myself moving through my morning routine with an energy and purpose I hadn't felt in months. I changed clothes 3 times, finally settling on dark jeans and a soft burgundy sweater that Helen had given me for Christmas. Nothing too formal, nothing that tried too hard, but something that made me feel like the best version of myself. I even put on makeup, something I'd stopped doing for casual outings years ago. Princess watched my preparations with the disdainful expression cats reserve for human behavior they find incomprehensible but beneath their notice. Don't look at me like that, I told her as I checked my appearance one final time. I'm allowed to care about how I look. Grind Coffee was busier than usual for a Saturday morning, filled with college students with laptops and young families with strollers. I spotted Robert immediately at a corner table, and felt that same little flutter of recognition and nervousness I'd experienced the night before. He was reading a paperback novel, wire-rimmed glasses perched on his nose, and looked up with a smile that seemed to light up his entire face when he saw me approaching. Good morning, he said, standing to greet me with the old-fashioned courtesy I was beginning to associate with him. You look lovely. Thank you. I felt heat rise in my cheeks and realized I was blushing like a teenager. Have you been waiting long? Just a few minutes. What can I get you? Large coffee, cream, no sugar, I said, grateful that he'd offered to order for me. The line at the counter was intimidating, full of people ordering complicated drinks with names I didn't recognize. While Robert stood in line, I settled into the chair across from his and looked around the cafe with fresh eyes. I'd been here dozens of times over the years, but always alone, always focused on my book or my thoughts. Seeing it as part of a shared experience, as a place where Robert and I were choosing to spend time together, made it feel entirely different. He returned with 2 large coffees and a plate with 2 enormous muffins. I wasn't sure if you'd eaten breakfast, he said, settling back into his chair. I got 1 blueberry, 1 chocolate chip. We can share. The simple thoughtfulness of the gesture, anticipating that I might be hungry, choosing varieties that would give us both options, struck me as remarkably considerate. Harold had been thoughtful too, but in different ways I'd grown so accustomed to over 35 years of marriage that I'd stopped noticing them. How did you sleep? Robert asked, breaking off a piece of the blueberry muffin. Terribly, I said with a laugh. I kept replaying our conversation, thinking about things I should have said differently. Such as, I don't know. Something more charming, maybe? Less neurotic? I sipped my coffee and found it perfectly prepared. I have very little experience with first-date conversation that goes beyond polite small talk. Neither do I, but I thought we did pretty well. Robert's eyes twinkled with humor. Besides, I found your neuroses charming. My neuroses? Your honesty about being scared, your admission that you don't know what you're doing. It's refreshing. Most people pretend to have everything figured out. I considered this. I suppose I'm too old to pretend anymore. What's the point of pretending to be confident when it's obvious I'm terrified? Exactly. One of the advantages of dating at our age, we're too tired for games. Is that what this is? I asked, surprised by my own directness. Dating? Robert paused with his coffee cup halfway to his lips. What would you call it? I don't know. I've been thinking about it since last night, and I don't have vocabulary for whatever this is. I gestured between us. When I was young, dating had clear stages and expectations. Now it feels like we're making it up as we go along. And how does that feel? Making it up. Liberating, I said without hesitation, then was surprised by my own answer. And terrifying. But mostly liberating. We sat quietly for a moment, sipping our coffee and sharing the muffins. The cafe buzzed with conversation around us, but I felt cocooned in our little corner, protected from the outside world by the growing intimacy of our connection. Can I tell you something I realized last night? Robert said. Of course. I've been thinking about Sarah a lot since we started talking, not in a guilty way, but in a grateful way. She taught me how to love someone completely, how to be a partner, how to share a life with another person. He paused, turning his coffee cup in his hands. I was worried that loving someone new would diminish what we had, but I think it's the opposite. The fact that I learned to love her so deeply is what makes me capable of loving someone else. I felt tears prick at my eyes. That's beautiful. Do you feel that way about Harold? I thought about the question seriously, examining my feelings with the kind of honesty Robert's presence seemed to inspire. Yes and no, I said finally. Harold was the love of my youth, the person who shaped how I understood marriage and partnership. But in some ways, our love was easy because we grew into it gradually. We were so young when we met, we learned to love each other at the same time we were learning to be adults. And now I know exactly who I am. I know my flaws and my strengths, my non-negotiables and my areas of flexibility. If I fall in love again, it will be a conscious choice made by a fully formed person, not something that happens to me while I'm still figuring out my identity. Robert nodded slowly. That sounds both harder and easier than young love. Exactly. I broke off a piece of chocolate chip muffin, thinking. Harder because there's less room for illusion, less ability to ignore incompatibilities in hopes they'll resolve themselves over time. But easier because I know what I want, what I need, what I'm willing to compromise on and what I'm not. What do you want? The question was gentle but direct. In a relationship, I mean. I considered lying, giving him some safe, generic answer about companionship and shared interests. But his honesty the night before had earned him mine in return. I want someone who makes me laugh, I said. Someone who's comfortable with silence but also capable of real conversation. I want someone who understands that grief doesn't have an expiration date, who won't try to fix me or rush me past difficult emotions. I paused, then continued with growing confidence. I want someone who has his own life and interests but who wants to share them with me. I want someone who's genuinely curious about other people, who asks questions and listens to the answers. I want someone who's kind to waitresses and patient with slow drivers and gentle with animals. That's a good list, Robert said softly. What about you? What do you want? He was quiet for a long moment, staring out the cafe window at the Saturday morning foot traffic. I want someone who sees me as I am now, not as who I used to be or who I might become, he said finally. Someone who's interested in my stories but doesn't need me to be anyone other than exactly who I am in this moment. He turned back to look at me directly. I want someone who's lived enough life to have perspective, who knows that most problems aren't actually emergencies and that most disagreements aren't worth fighting about. I want someone who laughs easily and cries honestly and isn't afraid of either emotion. And I want someone who makes me want to be the best version of myself, not because they're trying to change me, but because their presence in my life makes me remember who I am when I'm happy. The words hung between us, honest and vulnerable and surprisingly intimate for a Saturday morning coffee date. I realized we were doing it again, moving past small talk into the kind of conversation that revealed character, that created connection. Robert, I said carefully, I need to tell you something. His expression grew wary. Okay. Last night, when we were talking about wanting to fall in love again, about being open to possibility, I took a deep breath. I wasn't being entirely honest about my concerns. What do you mean? I said I was worried about logistics, about grown children and established routines and all the practical complications of dating at our age. I met his eyes directly. Those are real concerns, but they're not my biggest fear. What is? My biggest fear is that I'll fall in love with you. Robert's eyebrows rose, and I could see him processing what I'd said, trying to understand whether it was good news or bad news. Not because there's anything wrong with you, I continued quickly. Because there isn't. You're kind and thoughtful and interesting and attractive, and spending time with you makes me feel more like myself than I have in years. Then why is that frightening? Because I don't trust myself to love wisely anymore, I said, the words coming out in a rush. Harold and I grew into love slowly, over years. We had time to learn each other's rhythms, to accommodate each other's quirks, to build something sustainable. I gestured between us. This feels different. Faster. More intense. Like I could fall completely and permanently in love with you before I really know who you are, before I understand what I'm signing up for. Robert reached across the table and touched my hand. Margaret, we've known each other for less than 24 hours. Don't you think you're getting ahead of yourself? Am I? I looked at him seriously. Because it feels like I've been waiting my entire life to have the kind of conversation we had last night. It feels like you see me in a way that most people don't, in a way I'd forgotten was possible. I do see you, he said softly. And I feel seen by you. But that doesn't mean we have to make any grand declarations or life-changing decisions today. Then what do we do with this? I gestured between us again. This feeling, this connection, this sense that something important is happening between us? We take it one day at a time, Robert said. We spend time together, we keep talking, we see what develops naturally instead of trying to force it into a shape that makes us feel safer. I nodded, but something in my expression must have revealed my ongoing uncertainty. What is it? He asked. I'm not good at taking things one day at a time, I admitted. I'm a planner. I like to know what's coming, how things will work out, what I'm working toward. And how has that worked out for you? The question was gentle but pointed, and I couldn't help but laugh. Fair point. All my careful planning couldn't prevent Harold from having a heart attack at 58. All my attempts to control my life since then have mostly just resulted in loneliness. So maybe this is an opportunity to try something different, Robert suggested. Maybe this is a chance to practice trusting the process instead of trying to control the outcome. We talked for another hour, the conversation meandering through safer topics, books we'd enjoyed, places we'd traveled, funny stories about our children. But underneath the lighter subjects, I could feel the current of deeper connection we'd established, the sense that we were two people who had decided to be genuinely interested in each other. When we finally left the cafe, Robert walked me to my car with the same old-fashioned courtesy he'd shown the night before. "What are you doing this afternoon?" he asked as I fumbled with my keys. "Nothing planned. Reading, maybe some gardening if it stays warm." I looked up at him. "Why?" "There's an art fair in Riverside Park. Nothing fancy, just local artists selling their work. I thought you might enjoy it, and I could use the company." The invitation was casual, but I could see the hope in his eyes, the same tentative optimism I felt bubbling up in my own chest. "I'd like that," I said. "Should I meet you there?" "I could pick you up, if you're comfortable with that. Save you the trouble of finding parking." The offer was practical, but it also represented a small step toward deeper connection, letting him into my space, trusting him with my address, allowing our relationship to expand beyond neutral public venues. "That would be nice," I said, then gave him my address. "What time?" 2 o'clock? That gives us both time for lunch and a brief recovery from all this intensive conversation. I laughed. "Do you need recovery time?" "God, yes," Robert said with a grin. "I haven't talked this much about my feelings since Sarah made me go to grief counseling after her diagnosis. It's exhausting and wonderful and slightly terrifying." "I know exactly what you mean." He leaned down and kissed my cheek again, the same soft, brief contact we'd shared the night before. But this time I found myself turning slightly into the kiss, letting it linger for just a moment longer than was strictly platonic. "I'll see you at 2, he said, his voice slightly rougher than it had been a moment before. "See you at 2. I watched him walk to his truck, a practical Ford pickup that looked well-maintained but not new, and felt a little thrill of anticipation. 2 dates in less than 24 hours. At this rate, I'd have to completely restructure my careful retirement routine to accommodate a social life. The thought should have been daunting, but instead it felt like possibility. Back at home, I found myself moving through my house with new eyes, seeing it as Robert might see it when he came to pick me up. It was a comfortable space, decorated with furniture Harold and I had chosen together and artwork we'd collected during our travels. Nothing fancy, but everything chosen with care and maintained with pride. I straightened the living room automatically, then caught myself and laughed. I was acting like a teenager preparing for a boy to meet her parents, worried about making the right impression. But why shouldn't I care about how my home looked to someone whose opinion mattered to me? Princess followed me from room to room, sensing my unusual energy and expressing her displeasure with pointed meows and strategic positioning in my path. "I know this is disruptive to your routine," I told her as she wound around my ankles in the kitchen. But you might have to get used to occasional company. The words surprised me as I said them. Company. The idea of Robert becoming a regular presence in my life, of my home becoming a place where we spent time together, felt both natural and revolutionary. I made myself a light lunch and tried to read, but found my attention wandering. Instead, I found myself thinking about the questions Robert had asked, the assumptions he'd challenged, the way he'd listened to my answers with genuine interest rather than polite attention. When was the last time someone had been genuinely curious about my thoughts and feelings? Helen cared about my well-being, my other children called dutifully and asked how I was doing, but most of those conversations were about practical matters or surface-level updates. Robert had asked me what I wanted, what I feared, what I hoped for. He'd treated my inner life as something worth exploring. At exactly 2 o'clock, I heard a truck door slam in my driveway. I looked out the window to see Robert walking up my front path, moving with that careful gait that accommodated his bad leg. He'd changed from his morning outfit into dark jeans and a light blue button-down shirt that made his silver hair look distinguished. I opened the door before he could knock, suddenly nervous about this transition from public meetings to private space. "Hi," I said, feeling awkward in my own doorway. "Hi yourself." He looked past me into the house with obvious curiosity but no pushiness. "This is nice. Very welcoming. Would you like to come in for a minute? I just need to get my purse and a jacket." "I'd like that very much." I led him into the living room, hyper-aware of every detail he might notice, the family photos on the mantelpiece, Harold's reading chair that I'd never had the heart to move, the stack of library books on the coffee table. Robert moved through the space with respectful interest, pausing to look at a photograph of Harold and me at our daughter's wedding, another of my grandchildren at the beach last summer. "Your family looks happy," he said simply, and I was grateful that he didn't avoid mentioning Harold or act uncomfortable about the evidence of my previous life. "They are, mostly. The usual dramas and complications, but yes, we're fortunate." I grabbed my purse and a light cardigan. "Ready?" "Ready." As we walked to his truck, I realized this was another small milestone, getting into a vehicle with him, trusting him to drive me somewhere and bring me back safely. Such a simple thing, but it felt significant after years of complete independence. The art fair was exactly what Robert had promised, nothing fancy, just local artists displaying their work under white tents in the park. We walked slowly from booth to booth, looking at paintings and jewelry and pottery, making the kind of comfortable small talk that lets you learn about someone's tastes and preferences without the intensity of the deeper conversations we'd been having. "Do you like art?" Robert asked as we paused in front of a display of landscape paintings. "I like what I like," I said. "I'm not sophisticated about it, but I know what moves me." "What moves you?" I gestured toward a painting of an old farmhouse surrounded by autumn trees. "Things that tell a story. That painting makes me wonder who lived in that house, what their lives were like, whether they were happy there." Robert nodded thoughtfully. "I'm drawn to craftsmanship more than artistry, if that makes sense. I like things that are well made, that show the skill of the person who created them." We spent the next hour wandering through the fair, and I found myself paying as much attention to Robert's reactions as to the art itself. He was respectful to every artist, even when their work clearly didn't appeal to him. He asked thoughtful questions about technique and materials. He had opinions but held them lightly, without needing to convince anyone else to share them. At a jewelry booth, he stopped in front of a display of silver earrings. "Those would look beautiful on you," he said, pointing to a pair of simple silver hoops with small turquoise stones. I felt heat rise in my cheeks. "They're lovely. May I?" He looked at me questioningly, and when I nodded, he turned to the artist. "How much for these earrings?" "Robert, you don't need to." "I'd like to," he said simply. "If you'd like to have them." It was such a small gesture, but it felt enormous to me. Harold had bought me jewelry, of course, but that had been different, husband to wife, an expected part of our relationship. This felt like a gift between two people who were still choosing each other, still discovering what they might become together. I'd love to have them, I said softly. He paid the artist and handed me the small bag containing the earrings. Thank you for letting me do that. Thank you for wanting to. We found a bench near the park's small pond and sat watching the ducks paddle lazily across the water. Families with small children threw breadcrumbs from the shore, and teenagers played frisbee on the grass nearby. It was the kind of peaceful, ordinary scene that I'd observed hundreds of times over the years but never shared with someone who wasn't family. This is nice, I said, settling back against the bench. It is. Robert stretched his legs out in front of him. I'd forgotten how pleasant it is to have company for things like this. I go places by myself all the time, the library, the grocery store, church functions, but I'd stopped doing things just for pleasure. Everything became about errands or obligations. And now,